Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am at AK Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 177. And this episode, we're doing a console retrospective. Well, our handheld consoles, we've never really firmly established that, and terms are so slippery, but it's one of the best, one of the greatest, one of the most well-remembered, whether horizontal or in a little clamshell with a light on it. We're talking about the Gameboy Advance today. And
yes, we are.
Yes, we are. And to help us in our retrospective, because our own biases are fine in other contexts, but in a retrospective, we need to get more subjective opinions on this. So joining us from the Unloackables Podcast, Eric Guess. Thank you so much for joining us, Eric.
Oh my God, I didn't realize I was brought on here as the subjective opinion. I think
No, we're all subjective opinions here. That's the point. That is the point of this podcast.
I'm bringing the very heavy bias on this one, so you might have to get somebody else. But
talking about a console from our youth? Bias?
Nostalgia. The nostalgia goggles are on and they're firmly attached to my face. There's nothing we can do about that. But Matt, Geoff, I got goosebumps. Geoff, hearing you do that intro live in person, not having to just hear it on a pre-recorded episode. Incredible. So incredible. But
thank you.
It's so awesome to be podcasting with the both of you. I know, Matt, we've done a couple episodes on some other projects here. Geoff, it's an honor to finally meet and talk to you. I'm so excited. I saw Matt put out the call I don't know if it's a couple weeks or maybe like a month ago for this, and I messaged him like right away, and I'm like, please let me come on and talk about the GBA. I could not jump on it fast enough. So thank you guys.
From the timeline, it was a record-breaking, just like you hit the button, man.
I was like, this is my chance. I need to do it. So, but I'm so excited to podcast with the both of you, and this is going to be a great episode.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. Before we get into our spiel and talk about the Game Boy Advance, Eric, why don't you just give a quick pitch on what the Unloackables is?
What is the Unloackables? I ask myself that every day that I work on it. It's kind of evolving. But yeah, the Unloackables I bill as the story of video games, the people who played them, and the memories made along the way. I like how Josh from Still Loading podcast put it best. He said that I really try to reach the emotional core of a game and analyze it that way. And I also have people come on and talk about their shows. I've been getting some guests on to talk about games and kind of review them in that aspect. So kind of a little bit of everything. You'll get a little bit of review. You get a little bit of guest collaboration. There's something on there for everybody. My big project that I'm probably most well known for, infamously known for, is my Guiding Keys series, where I'm playing the entire Kingdom Hearts series front to back, chronicling my adventures through my favorite game series of all time and breaking down the story for people who are maybe intimidated by the story of that game, because it can get a little complicated in there, but that's probably what I'm most well known for.
Well, to clarify, is that the Kingdom Hearts series in chronological order or release order?
It's in release order.
Okay.
Which is, I still think, oh boy, we're going down this tangent. Here we go. Release order is still the best way to play it, because even though the games in release order are not in chronological order, I find that they still build on each other in a really intuitive way if you do play them in release order, and that's the way that makes the most sense. Yeah, if you're going back to like the beginning and trying to play from the start of the timeline, whew, boy, that would be a Herculean effort.
Absolutely. I wanted to clarify for those who are intimidated by the storyline, and honestly, going in chronological versus release order, I find to be the exception rather than the rule in most lore-heavy game series.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine trying to play the Zelda games in chronological order.
Oh my
God.
God.
That would be a goddamn nightmare.
You're going to need 3 TVs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
But enough about chronological game series. Today, we are here to talk about, in my opinion, one of the best handheld gaming consoles ever made, and by my estimation, one of the best video game consoles ever made, the Game Boy Advance. Now, Geoff did bring up an interesting point at the beginning that handheld consoles were often considered separate from home consoles, but with the invention of the Switch and the Steam Deck, I feel like that starts to merge more and more every day. But for my money, the Game Boy Advance had the biggest bang for its buck as far as quality, design, ergonomics, and quality of the software. The Game Boy Advance was released March 21st of 2001 in Japan, on June 11th in North America. In the EU, it was June 22nd, and in the AU, June 22nd. So mostly around the same time. This is when I think game and console releases started to lean more to simultaneous release. We weren't quite there yet. We wouldn't get there probably still for another few generations, but we were headed in that direction. This, for me, was one of the first consoles I remember, like handheld specifically, because I talked about the Wii being one of the first consoles I camped out for. The Game Boy Advance, I was so excited about. I got a Game Boy like third hand when I was playing the original Game Boy. And when then I saw that we were getting a new kind of Game Boy device, I don't think I was quite working at GameStop yet. That wouldn't be till the DS. But I was enough of a gamer nerd at that point that I was like, oh, this thing's coming. I want it. And like saved up my dollars and got it on release. To start off our first experiences with it, I know I had the purple Game Boy Advance back in the heyday of when we got colored consoles. We still get that sometimes now, but definitely not as much as we used to. Still waiting for that atomic purple Switch. Nintendo don't let me down with the Switch.
Take our
2.
money,
right?
Nintendo. Come on.
Even just the Joy-Cons, just give it to me.
But I got this at release, and I think Super Mario Advance was the game I got with it because that was a launch title, as I recall, and because it was a re-release of Mario 2, a game that I really loved growing up, the American Mario 2 to be specific. It's like talking about Final Fantasy games now. It's like, is it 2? Is it 4? Who cares? Doesn't matter. Super Mario Advance came out with the console, and so I'm pretty sure I got that at launch. Most of my favorite games wouldn't come till much later, but I do think that I was just so excited to have this new console, and it blew my little mind that I was playing a Nintendo game, actually the Super Nintendo re-render of a Nintendo game on a handheld console. Meanwhile, now with the Steam Deck, we can play PS2 games on the go. So like this was kind of the beginning for me of that like, oh, home console doesn't mean anything. It's just the power of the thing making the thing, and kind of blew my little gamer mind. To you, Geoff, I know that with you, especially on these retrospectives, it can be hit or miss. Some consoles you've gotten at launch, but a lot of them have been on a delay time, whether max or min. What was your story with the Game Boy Advance? Did you get this when it came out?
I did not. The Game Boy Advance was one that I followed, though. I mean, I definitely was a kid who obsessively read gaming magazines, whether I had a subscription to them or I read them at a friend's house, whatever I could get my hands on. I loved just finding out what was coming through. And that included rumors and ideas about the super advanced Game Boy console that was going to have cell phone technology and a 32-bit processor and all this crazy shit even before the Game Boy Color was announced. Now, through the benefit of hindsight, and more organized historians than myself know that those were what would eventually become the Game Boy Advance. With Game Boy consoles, for me, I had a bad chain of finally saving up money and getting one right when they announced the next one. I got a Game Boy Pocket and my copy of Pokemon Blue right before the Game Boy Color came out. When I finally got a Game Boy Color, like 2 weeks later. So I probably got a Game Boy Pocket in like May of 2001.
Oh, wow.
Probably wasn't that close, but it felt like it. I did get a Game Boy Advance. I got a regular horizontal Game Boy Advance. It was one of those, I saved up for the console and my mother bought a game. That was always the deal whenever I saved up for these things. That was how I got Pokemon kind of thing. But there were 2 games and I couldn't decide between them. And so my mother just went, oh, for the love of God, and got both of them. It was one of the few times she ever did that kind of exasperated parent thing, and I've never tried to force it again. The games I got were Metroid Fusion and Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo.
Mm-hmm.
Because I played
Nice.
the demo to Puzzle Fighter on my PS1 so much and never got the game. And so the fact that it was on the Game Boy Advance, that was the thing that blew my mind. You know, this perfect, incredible Metroid game, yeah, that's cool. But Puzzle Fighter. And we all know which one is more storied and loved in history. So I feel vindicated personally.
And we made it about 15 minutes before we mentioned Metroid. And trust me, we're going to talk about Metroid a lot more with this console. But before we get to that, Eric, what about you? You were so excited to come on the show. So, like, were you a day oneer? Did you get this console the day it came out?
I'm not 100% sure. My timeline is a little fuzzy on the GBA in general because a lot of this gaming stuff for me was happening around the same time. I think if Game Boy Advance was in 2001, I would have been 10 years old at the time. So it's starting to get hard to reach that far back. And
I hear that, yeah.
at the time, I know I had, like, the Super Nintendo was my first console. I had a PS1, I had a PS2, I had an N64. And I was really sort of kind of like jumping back and forth between them because I had games to play on them that I still loved. And the console generations didn't really like make sense to me in my young brain that these were like separate things kind of. So I just played them all. So yeah, when I saw the Game Boy Advance announced, I assumed I probably saw Nintendo Power because I was an avid Nintendo Power subscriber back during those days. Rest in peace, Nintendo Power.
Here, here.
And I'm pretty sure I saw it. I too, like Matt, remember having the indigo purple Game Boy Advance, which I think is kind of like the flagship iconic Game Boy Advance that everybody thinks about when they think of that console. My memories of it are more strongly tied to the SP version, though. I remember getting a silver Game Boy SP, and I think I got the first round of SPs that had like the front lit light.
Yeah.
It didn't have the backlighting yet, but it had the front lit. I know there were 2 specific ones in there. And that was what really unlocked the full potential of the Game Boy Advance for me because I think one of the original Game Boy Advance's Probably the thing that gets knocked for the most is not having that backlit screen, it being kind of hard to see and play. Like, I remember, I know we'll get into accessories and stuff, but I had one of like the curly Q wire lights that would plug into the top and you'd have to shine down on it to play
The Nyko, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. But I remember distinctly bringing my Game Boy SP with me everywhere. During that time in my life, from like 2001 to 2005, we were like playing sports. I was on travel bowling. I was just at my friend's house like every other day, and my Game Boy Advance SP came with me everywhere. And all my other friends had Game Boy Advances. So it was just like, it was hard to bring consoles to other people's houses at that age and time. It's just like wasn't something you didn't bring the console out of the house like your friend's house or something like that. So we all brought our Game Boys and just played games and stuff. And I'd been an avid Game Boy fan since, I mean, I had one as early as I could possibly remember. And obviously anyone that had the original Game Boy remembers the craze that was Pokemon. I was really big into Pokemon. That kind of sustained my love for the Game Boy up until the Game Boy Advance came out. And then funny enough, the Game Boy Advance was kind of my break in the Pokemon series. I skipped Gen 3 on the Game Boy Advance. Never played Ruby and Sapphire. Skipped Gen 4 on the DS, and I didn't come back to Pokemon until college. But a lot of the games that I played on there, I have really fond memories of. The Intelligent System strategy games, Advance Wars and Fire Emblem, Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories, obviously. We mentioned Metroid Fusion. Funny enough, though, Matt mentioned like some Mario games and stuff. I was a huge Mario fan. No Mario games on the Game Boy Advance for me. So I didn't get like any of the Super Mario Advance releases or any kind of the ports that they brought over from the Super Nintendo or the NES, which is really kind of weird. Mario Kart Super Circuit's the only Mario thing. I love this console to death. I still pull it out and I still play it. I still have a bunch of my old Game Boy Advance games. Like to this day, it's just something that gives me like a nice warm and fuzzy feeling. So if I'm just like sad one day or just be like, man, I want to remember what it was like to be a kid in a carefree world, just pull out the Game Boy Advance and just go back into a time, just a couple hours, and don't worry about the world so much.
I think you're really hitting the nail on the head there as far as like that specific kind of nostalgia that the GBA gives, because it's such an interesting point of game design, of storage space, of graphics, where it is unequivocally an older console. Even at the time we were dealing with sprites in 2D, if there was any polygons in it, it was a big deal kind of thing. So even then it was, you know, the usual Nintendo Game Boy, like a little bit of a step back. But Nintendo had been at this for a while. And the Game Boy Advance could play the Game Boy Color and the original Game Boy games that you loved. And so you're playing the GBA. You're probably playing GBA games, but, you know, what if Link's Awakening gets in there? We're all going to be fine here. But even nowadays, where some older, more obtuse designs of the Game Boy and even Game Boy Color can be a little tricky for our own nostalgia or for bringing to someone as if it's new, a lot of GBA stuff, I don't know. And I think some of it actually has to do with that weird transition from non-backlight to backlight, of the horizontals to the SP, to make up for the fact that they didn't have any lighting at all. Those colors were bright.
Yep.
Those graphics were just in your goddamn face. There is something joyous, weird, festive, even in some of the more gloomy games on the Game Boy Advance. And so there is something interesting about the specific glow of nostalgia that the GBA gives.
Before we get too far into the graphics stuff, because it's what I want to gush about next, it's funny, Eric, that you mentioned the Mario games. There was not an original Mario platformer on the Game Boy Advance, one of the few consoles to not get a brand new Mario game. It did get Mario and Luigi. It launched that series on that console, which is a favorite RPG of mine. And Super Circuit, which was an incredible Mario Kart game, especially for a handheld game. It was one of the first, felt legitimate handheld Mario Kart games. But they just had the Mario Advance series, which was just an out-of-order re-release of Mario titles. Mario 2, the American version, Mario 3, and Mario World.
And not even in that order.
It was completely out of order.
No, it was completely out of order. I think it was 2 World, 3 Island.
Yoshi's Island, and then 3.
Oh, Island, and then 3.
Because I always will remember we're playing Super Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Brothers 3.
Yep. No, it makes perfect sense.
We can't make sense here. This is Mario. Right. And they did have the Super Mario Brothers Deluxe as the re-release of 1 on the Game Boy Color. So I see where they're coming from, but still completely off the rails. And I remember even back then when the GBA was being released and they were like, oh, but what's the launch Mario title going to be? It's Mario 2. Mm-hmm. Everyone was mad.
Yeah. I mean, it's to this day the only Nintendo console not to launch or at all have a new Mario game. The DS had new Super Mario Brothers. The 3DS had 3D Land.
Yeah, they do eventually get them, even if they don't launch. But yeah, you're absolutely right. This is the only one that didn't have an original Mario Series 2 itself.
Right. Its only original Mario series was Mario and Luigi, which again launched on that console, which is fascinating to me. It's just such an anomaly. Meanwhile, most other consoles barely get one Metroid game, and this console got two, technically three, because they got the NES Classic release of the original Metroid. Which is wild to me. It's just so backwards ass. It did, however, get a shitload of Kirby games, some of the best Kirby
Preach
games.
it.
And like talking about remakes and re-releases, there were a ton on this console.
Mm-hmm.
But to this day, the optimal way to play my favorite game, Kirby's Adventure, is to play Nightmare in Dreamland, the
Preach
Game Boy
it.
Advance re-release. And like, I love the original NES title. It's close to my heart, but I replayed the Game Boy Advance game recently, and like, it just improves everything. And it's gorgeous. I mean, the Kirby games always looked good, but like the thing that I think makes the Game Boy Advance so special, it's the last time a console was completely devoted to sprite and pixel art. We go back to it now, and plenty of consoles do it, but the DS started to pivot towards 3D models. The new Super Mario Brothers had 3D models, not sprite art.
Well, I mean, their launch Mario title was Super Mario 64
Yep.
DS. So, yeah, they were there from the beginning.
Right. It's just fascinating to me and why I think those games look so good. It's also why I love the early Shantae games so much, because they absolutely ape that style completely. There's just something about pixel art. We've talked about this countless times on this podcast. Pixel art will always age more gracefully than polygons. There are plenty of games with polygons that still look good or have a charm to them. But there's something about the intricacies of sprite work that will always look better no matter what year it comes out or how old it's been. It's why I'm so excited that at some point next year, we're getting a brand new Shantae game for the Game Boy Advance made for that hardware.
Hell yeah.
Like, it's just one of those consoles that I think will always be special to me because there are no games like these games. You will not see games that look like these games elsewhere. When they move to other platforms, they evolved in different ways and still look good in different ways. But like Geoff is right, because the original display was so muted, they had to amp up the colors. And like, I didn't know what Metroid Fusion really looked like till I played the NSO port of it, because it's like kind of rejudged. So it looks like how it looked, but there was no backlight at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that because of that, Geoff is right. No games will look like these games because they had to be designed differently to adjust to what people could see. And then when the SP came out with the front light and the backlight, it just blew the colors out in a way that also was wild, but still made them look gorgeous.
I refer to it as like the GBA graphical style. Like, I can't even describe that because I'm not a video game designer, so I'm like really bad at that. But I think when I say that, everybody immediately understands like what that means. Yeah, all these games, like any game you played, had this just beautiful, bright, colorful sprite work. And I think that's probably what does it. What generates that feeling of that nostalgia is that beautiful, colorful, bright sprite work. I mean, I've mentioned a couple of my favorite games, Advance Wars 1 and 2. Those games have a very specific look for a very specific point in time for a very specific console. And it made war look like fun and colorful, and it is kind of adorable, even though it was like war. But that's besides the point. So yeah, really, those types of games, again, to kind of pivot to Fire Emblem as well. Those sprites, those animations, the way those were colored, again, the same thing. It's got such a unique color to it. It's my favorite sprite-based pixel art, probably across any single system that launched. Even today, even some games come out with beautiful, stunning pixel artwork or sprite-based artwork for like some indie titles and stuff, and you go back and play the GBA and you're just like, this is really specific to this console, this time period, to what they were doing with this hardware.
Yeah. Eric, you raise an excellent point in that there is something distinctive about the GBA graphics. The Game Boy Advance isn't alone in having graphics that you look at a retro game nowadays or a throwback game, someone's making a new indie game with sprite graphics, you can almost look at it and kind of go, this is coded as being for this console in whatever way that it is. A lot of Nintendo handhelds, I don't know if this happened to y'all, but it certainly happened to me, that feeling of when one would come out, sort of the argument was it is the portable blank older Nintendo console.
Yes.
Yeah.
And certainly the Mario Advance series was part of that, where the GBA was sort of the portable Super Nintendo, with actually some additional bells and whistles to it, but, that's not as snappy. What sets it apart from the Super Nintendo was its needs. As we've been talking about, whether it was a front light that slightly washed things out or no light at all, you needed heavy contrast, you needed bold lines, and you needed bright colors. Whether it was something like Castlevania Circle of the Moon, one of the early titles that was on the console, despite being gloomy and dark, still had bright contrasting colors to some of the monsters, to your protagonist, and then Harmony of Dissonance just went even crazier with it. You think of things in like a WarioWare kind of design, and so I'm thinking of games like the upcoming Anton Blast being very GBA coded, as it were, designed in that style, because in order to catch those eyes, in order to work with the motion on things, and I'm pretty sure, and I'm going to look up what the exact resolution on the GBA screen is, it's kind of low. It's got a widescreen aspect to it, but it's basically a widescreen Game Boy Color. So there again, having to have lines that you can follow while still having colors you can parse on a graphical processor that's doing its best resulted in a style, a palette, a look that we all still look back on fondly, and people are trying to ape it because it's actually very good. This is where necessity breeds genius.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we can say the same for the speakers and the sound chip and the music design. I mean, there are games on this console that have music unlike any other games in their series. I recently, well, as of by the time this airs, it's not as recent, but it was this year, I guested on the Retro Hangover podcast talking about Metroid Zero Mission. The way they recreate that soundtrack for Zero Mission just is crunchy in a way that it wouldn't have been on the NES. It couldn't be on any other console. And I think just adds to the ambiance of that game. Most people don't praise Metroid for their soundtracks other than they fit the vibe, right? Soundtracks can be really good for Metroid games, but it's all in service of the narrative and the world. On the opposite end of the game, I'm going to talk about a lot more later, Wario Land 4, one of the greatest 2D platformers ever created, has the most wild soundtrack, especially because they digitized tons of vocals for that soundtrack. Because the space was so much bigger, they were like, well, we have this extra space. We created the game. Let's digitize all this stuff. And like the sound test for that game isn't really a sound test because it's actually like these collectible CDs that you get that are just these weird sound effects and voice clips from the game. Some are used within songs, some are buried somewhere within the game. It's some of my favorite and wackiest sound design across the console.
I think you really notice a really big difference when going from like the Game Boy to the Game Boy Advance. Like the Game Boy has a lot of like the classic 8-bit chiptune types of music, and you hear Game Boy music and it's really identifiable, oh, like this is classic 8-bit stuff. But then when you make the jump to the Game Boy Advance and you play something like Ruby Sapphire, which those soundtracks are really well known for having like these bombastic trumpet scores, then you switch to something like Advance Wars that has these CO themes that have like guitars and drums and stuff that are playing. And then you switch to something like Metroid Fusion, where it is like a more atmospheric type of soundtrack. And there are distinct instruments that you can hear and just different distinct sound channels that they're able to access to just create something that is far beyond what the original Game Boy could do. I have Game Boy Advance soundtracks like stuck in my head like to this day. They're like earworms. They get in your head and they just don't leave. They had to design these sounds in such a way to take up as little space as possible, but also not be incredibly annoying. But they also have whole access, a new suite of instruments to be able to compose with. So that's got to be absolutely nuts to be like, I have so much more I can do, but I have to do it in such like a restricted, limited manner. And again, it just creates something that is unique to Nintendo because no one does what Nintendo does. Because at this time, like you said, we're transitioning to the age of 3D. 3D consoles are a little bit more, you can kind of develop for them in like similar ways, right? And then I think now where we are in the industry, it's kind of homogenized itself to like, these are the set of tools you use to make like 3D games and stuff. And this is the way you compose and it's more efficient. Back then, that was just not the case. So GBA sound, I'm glad Matt mentioned that. It's just, again, part of that nostalgia for sure.
The Game Boy Advance is one of those consoles also that we hinted at it earlier, but this is when remakes and remasters really started. We'd seen them in other places. Super Nintendo did a few, but this is when Nintendo was remaking a bunch of their stuff. They were re-releasing not only their stuff, but Sega's stuff started to first show up on Nintendo platforms around this era. Yeah. One of the worst versions of Sonic the Hedgehog is on this console, the Sonic the Hedgehog Advance, which is absolutely the worst screen crunch I've ever seen on a video game ever. And that's saying something.
Not to be confused with Sonic Advance. Sonic the Hedgehog Advance. Or Genesis. Sonic the Hedgehog Genesis.
The Sonic Advance series, to this day, I say, is some of the best 2D Sonic games ever made. It kills me that there's no collection for them. I have acquired them through totally legal means so I can replay them. And they are still to this day some of my favorite 2D games. But I think what really made the Game Boy Advance special is from the Super Nintendo era to the N64 and the GameCube, we really started to see the influx of popularity of RPGs in the States. RPGs were popular before that, and I'm not saying they weren't, but I think they just became more common vernacular in this era, especially for younger gamers. The Mario and Luigi series, but also we saw re-releases of Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy I, the Golden Sun series. Some of the most iconic RPGs came out on this console, even though you skipped the third generation, Eric. The third generation was one of the more highly praised Pokemon generations, some folks' favorite generation still to this day. We got remakes of the original Gen 1 games, and we got Leaf Green. So we got the green version for the first time in the States as well, which made me really happy. I bought that day one because I was so pissed I couldn't buy Pokemon Green growing up because Bulbasaur, to this day, is one of my favorite Pokemon. I think there's something truly special about the Game Boy Advance when it comes to RPGs because they were really trying something different. It was the earliest we saw. The Fire Emblem series was on this console as well, at least in the States. But like Golden Sun 1 and 2, especially Golden Sun 1, to this day, I don't think I've ever played an RPG like those games. I think what they were trying to do was just so unique, and we did get, I think, some terrible third game that nobody talks about.
The New Age, or is it Dark Dawn? Because there was 2 on GBA and then 1 on the DS, I think.
The DS is the bad one nobody likes.
Dark Dawn.
Myself included, because I can't even remember what it existed on. But I think there's something really special about how RPGs were handled on this console. And they will be continued to be handled pretty well. But I think that, at least for me, I can only speak for myself as someone who played video games. I loved Chrono Trigger. I got to it late. I loved Super Mario RPG, but like I never played any of the Super Nintendo Final Fantasies at that time. I didn't really get really big into Final Fantasy till the PlayStation era. But even then, it wasn't until Final Fantasy VII and then like, again, the Golden Sun games and Mario and Luigi on this console that I really was like, oh, I understand what an RPG is. I like these kinds of games. Wait, there's not just one kind of RPG. You can do this differently. It really opened my eyes to see what storytelling could be like also on the Game Boy Advance. We got good stories and interesting stories on the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color for sure, but I don't think anything quite as in depth on a handheld until we got to this console with its ability to tell stories like in Advance Wars and even Fire Emblem and the Zelda games. I haven't even brought this up, but Capcom made killer Game Boy games for the Zelda series, both on the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance. But to this day, I will shout from the rooftops that the Minish Cap is one of the best Zelda games ever made, and one of the few Zelda games that doesn't require Ganon to be good, though Ganon does, I believe, get a cameo as like a ghost or like a summon, essentially.
Gotta ruin it.
Yeah, gotta ruin it. Bavati being the villain, the way that the Minish Cap worked, the way that the game was designed, like it just felt like a cartoon come to life. Kind of also blew my mind and unfortunately spoiled me for the terrible DS games you would get after that sort of fall in that art style. My hopes were so high, but I love the Minish Cap, and I just feel like nobody talks about it because the Game Boy Advance has its dedicated fans, but again, a lot of these games, until very recently, never got really re-released anywhere. I'm grateful for NSO, as imperfect as it is that people are now talking about the Minish Cap and Mario and Luigi and a bunch of other games, again, the Golden Sun series, which kind of just disappeared with this console in a way that I feel like other branches of those popular franchises, that hasn't happened with. I mean, I just had to vent and gush about Minish Cap. My favorite things about Zelda and why I'm excited for the new one, as of when we're recording, that's coming really soon, is when Zelda kind of pivots on a hard left and like makes your head spin. I like formulaic Zelda games too. I'll play them till the cows come home. But when Zelda kind of does something different and uses unique mechanics, it's why Link Between Worlds is also one of my favorites, is like that's when I get engaged the most. I think also Minish Cap has one of the best Zelda soundtracks too, because it was very unique. They had to do something different based on how that game was designed.
The legacy of RPGs on the Game Boy Advance is very impressive. Like you mentioned, Final Fantasy VII was the big thing. That was what opened the door for a lot of people, right? So you think about the timing of this and look at Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6 were on the Game Boy Advance. A bunch of Dragon Quest games were on the Game Boy Advance. I played Breath of Fire too. Breath of Fire is probably a really deep-cut RPG series for a lot of people.
For a lot of folks, yeah.
And I played it as like an 11-year-old on the Game Boy Advance, a game that you probably wouldn't have played back in the day until Final Fantasy VII made us realize, oh, these are really good and they have really engaging stories. So yeah, I think the legacy of RPGs is probably maybe one of the more underrated, under-talked about aspects of the GBA. Also, too, again, to Matt's point, we were getting kind of like all the ports and the remakes and stuff. People are so mad about, oh, the Switch just gets all the Wii U games and blah, 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 and all this stuff. It's like the Game Boy Advance did like the same thing, and it was great, and it was fine. It doesn't matter.
We loved it.
Yeah, and we loved it. It was fine.
Nintendo fans, if nothing else, will buy the same game 8
Yep.
times. That's just who we
And
are.
we'll bitch the entire time.
It's true.
Correct. 100%.
Listen, the insults are coming from inside the fan club. This is fine.
It's true.
As we've noted already, this was 2001 to 2005, which was kind of before we had the DS, whatever else, where a lot of gaming culture was shifting as far as realization about stuff, about what was being brought to other regions from Japan. I mean, one of the reasons why RPGs weren't a big deal for a very long time was Japan kind of went, America doesn't like RPGs. Some of that was correct as far as the market was concerned, and some of us sitting here are going, just show them to us. We'll play them. God. I mean, I loved the original Final Fantasy on NES, and I was excited to chomp into all of the remakes that were happening and everything else that was finally getting its turn in the sun. So we were getting a little bit of, here are the games you missed in one way or another. I mean, again, my first game on the GBA, Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, was because I couldn't find a PlayStation copy of it. It didn't have a very large print run, but I had a great deal of love for it already. And that's not even getting into the RPGs. And that's not even getting into the fact that we still haven't seen Mother 3. But we did get some releases otherwise. The Switch, in its indie releases, in its NSO incarnations and whatnot, is playing cleanup in terms of those games that we heard so much about or have fond memories of. Well, here they are again. The GBA was the first one to really do that, certainly for Nintendo. And a lot better than the NES Classic series that they did in 04. That did give us the NES colored Classic Edition SP. When that thing came out, I snatched it up.
I think that the Game Boy Advance just was Nintendo firing on all cylinders. It was a sequel to their best-selling console of all time. The first true sequel, you know, the iterations of the Pocket and the Color weren't technically brand new consoles, though I guess the Color sort of is because there were games only on the Color.
It was a deluxe edition. I think you're right. There was some backwards compatibility and forwards compatibility there.
But also, I feel like it wouldn't be one of our retrospectives if we didn't dive into the bizarre peripherals and attachments. What's interesting is it was so hard then to see the through line now, but the link cable using the Game Boy Advance to play Zelda 4 Swords on the GameCube is literally the precursor to the Wii U. We would have never understood it then. But it is absolutely a true fact now that you're using the small screen to do stuff on the big screen and vice versa. But this console didn't have as many peripherals and attachments as other handhelds have. It had a few. The biggest one, of course, was the link cable to the GameCube, allowing you to play games between the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube, like 4 Swords, the Mario games. There was some overlap here and there. Mario Party, I even think, as well. I know that one of the biggest peripherals that is still kind of the bane of Geoff's existence is the e-reader. Geoff, do you want to talk a little bit about the Nintendo e-reader and the debacle that was?
I mean, I could talk about all kinds of things. I could spend an entire hour talking about the link cable. The e-reader is honestly kind of a cool idea. Like, let's not mince words. It's pretty cool. It was its own peripheral that went into the cartridge slot. You would get little cards that had barcode scan codes that you could swipe through and affect things in other games. You would be able to unlock items in some games. You'd be able to unlock levels. You'd be able to play entire NES games. During the NES Classic series, you could scan like 4 or 5 of these cards and then be able to play a complete NES game. The scan quality on these weren't perfect. Consider we were children and we were trying to keep our cards clean and in good condition. I don't know if any valuable Magic the Gathering card I had as a child would have held value if I kept it as an adult. So there's a bit of that. What was brought over wasn't nearly enough. The part that makes me upset and why Matt declared it sort of the bane of my existence, which is an exaggeration, but how slight we'll decide later. I like to collect things. I'm a collector. I have an excellent physical collection of games, and I like collecting the artifacts therein. I don't need to collect amiibos. This is so much easier to store than amiibos, but these were basically pre-amiibos. The part that makes me upset about it, but also I'm okay with it now, is Super Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Bros. 3 had so many stages that could be unlocked through e-reader cards, and the vast majority of them did not reach America.
Oof.
And we have seen our vindication there, because the version of Super Mario Advance for Super Mario Bros. 3, yes, the whole thing, yes, every time, is on Nintendo Switch Online and has all of the e-reader levels easily accessible from the beginning. Everything else is fun and a curiosity, but that was the one in particular where they went hard and we didn't get to benefit at the time. It's a funky little thing that I'm glad existed and I'm glad does not still exist. You know what I mean?
I would say my only interaction or even experience with the e-reader, I was very light on peripherals for my GBA as a whole. Once I got the SP, the only peripheral that I consistently used, aside from like the link cable, which we did use to play Advance Wars multiplayer, which was awesome. My most distinct memory of the e-reader stuff is still collecting Pokemon cards around that time, and the Pokemon cards having e-reader stuff on them.
That's
and I think
right.
you could like scan and do like battles or catch Pokemon in Ruby and Sapphire. I'm assuming that's how that worked. Surprising that they like threw the full force of like, hey, we're gonna put this e-reader stuff even on your Pokemon cards, and it didn't really work out. I mean, I assume it was probably a failure because I haven't like gone back to it since, or maybe they've iterated on it somehow.
We've got QR codes now.
Oh yeah, you're right. So it kind of defeats the point. Or they did like Street Pass stuff, and then the DS had like online and all that kind of stuff. So not really any reason to go back to it. But I didn't have any friends that like had one. But I just remember getting all like these barcodes on my Pokemon cards, and I was like, what is going on here?
Yeah. I think also we didn't get nearly as many wild peripherals on the GBA because we had several games that were the peripherals.
Correct.
I mean, we had the gyroscopic idea of Kirby Tilt and Tumble on the Game Boy Color, but we had WarioWare Twisted. We had Boktai.
The sun is in your hands.
Yes.
Which we have a side quest episode on, by the way.
Exactly. Hideo Kojima saying, the best way to fight vampires on the go is to put a sun sensor in your Game Boy Advance cartridge. Literally go outside, touch grass, fight vampires.
Just wild. Also, don't forget that the Game Boy Advance introduced, I think, the first time a handheld console supported video playback. And we got those absolutely compressed to shit, terrible Game Boy Advance video.
Best way to watch SpongeBob. No, it's not.
It's SpongeBob, Dragon Ball GT, Pokemon, Sonic X, Ninja Turtles, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and so many other things. The entirety of Shrek 1, Shrek 2, and Shark Tale were also on Game Boy Advance cartridges.
Legendary.
And like,
how many cartridges did that take?
I think Shrek was just on one cart.
That's insane.
It's just wild to me.
Like when I watch Shrek, I just change out 14 carts. It's like...
And we all shat on the UMD.
Right, yeah, right.
Right? It's so funny because like then the UMD had also movies, which were hit or miss as well on the handheld. But like now nobody is clamoring for that. Hell, we still don't even have Netflix on the Switch, but I won't even get into that. It's one of those things where like I totally forgot, but I used to own episodes of Sonic X on my Game Boy Advance that I would absolutely watch all the time.
Oh my God, yeah. No, it's the VHSs from another age of childhood. Your parents didn't drive the minivan that had the little tape player in the car. Mine certainly didn't. So, this is your way of watching your cartoons.
Yeah.
It doesn't serve every market, but I'm sure for some folks, that was a key piece of their childhood.
Yeah.
Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories famously is one of the few games on that system that like utilized that video aspect to do like an FMV, like full graphic cutscene. You would see like how it was on like a PS2 game. Wasn't great. And they only did it like at the start, at the end. So used it very sparingly, but it did manage to do that. And I remember seeing it at the time and I was like, whoa, like no other Game Boy Advance game was doing this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And while this was a bigger part of our GameCube episode, which I think we mentioned, games like Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, Pac-Man Versus, and Legend of Zelda Four Swords Adventures used the link cable to the GameCube from the Game Boy Advance to do some really cool stuff. I mean, Crystal Chronicles, a lot of folks like to crap on that game, and it's far from perfect, but I think it was such a fun way to do multiplayer Final Fantasy, and to this day, besides the MMOs, one of the few multiplayer Final Fantasy games. And I really liked the first game. I didn't play the Switch game, the sequel. I've heard it was a mixed bag. That bums me out. But I really did love that original game, mostly because it was just an excuse to play multiplayer Final Fantasy. Now, that meant that one of your characters was Vase Bitch, but that's okay. The other three characters got to have a good time, so it was fine. I was joking a little bit, and it was a little hyperbolic, but it is true that you can trace a through line from this link cable and this multi-console connection to the Wii U and then the Switch, right? This dual system, dual purpose mentality. And I think it's really fascinating that it kind of seems like it started here.
I don't think there's anything wild or outlandish about that. Nintendo doesn't throw ideas away. It just repurposes them. So you can look at something like the GBA GameCube link cable also as a precursor to the DS. That same idea of dual screen gameplay. You didn't have touchscreen on the GBA, but you still had some secondary aspects going on there. I mean, you were just talking about the e-reader sort of, well, that's a little bit of Amiibo, that's a little bit of QR codes. They wanted to have cell phone functionality. If I'm remembering correctly, there was a Japan-only accessory that kind of worked with some phone stuff.
Yes.
They weren't able to make all of that work in other regions, so it just kind of stayed there. And that was to sort of the city culture of Japan. But they were reaching, and some things succeeded incredibly, and some things are e-readers. You know, the GameCube link cable. Isn't it cool to be able to play the original Metroid, original version, if you've plugged in, what was it, your Metroid Zero mission to your Metroid Prime on both consoles?
Yeah.
But it was still really cool.
And it did a couple of other cool things too. I distinctly remember if you owned Mario Kart Super Circuit and you were the only one of your friends that had it, if you linked to other people, they could play a limited track selection if they didn't have the game cartridge.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of games. I think Advance Wars had that feature too, where you could play a couple maps. Pretty consumer-friendly move there from Nintendo, or maybe that's like a marketing strategy where it's like, oh, if you link with your friends and get them to play the game, then they'll want the game. Maybe that's that philosophy there. But I just thought that was like a really, really cool thing where it's like, you're not limited by your friends not having the game. You can still play this, and even if it's in a limited form.
I would argue it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
Where, yeah, it's good advertising, definitely. Like, you play a game at a friend's house, you want it. But I didn't own a copy of Mario Kart DS until I was already an adult. But I played it so much in college because someone had a copy, and you only needed one for 8-player multiplayer local. So
That's insane.
Just sitting in the common area in the dorms, getting to race in Mario Kart, it was incredible. So yeah, I think it was a little bit of both.
I mean, it was the precursor to the DS download and play, which was like free demos between friends, which I think was wild. I mean, now just everything has digital download, and so you can just download demos. It's not quite the same. We've done laments at length about demos and the idea of demos on this podcast. We will probably do more.
Always.
Before we wrap up the peripheral talk, I do want to mention the Australia-only Glucoboy, which was a glucose monitor with built-in games, released in Australia in 2007 for children with diabetes. I know nothing more than that from the Wikipedia page, and that is wild to me. Not surprising, just wild.
Like, all the medical things that I had to do as a child, I would have done them so much more happily and enthusiastically if there was a game attached to it. Why wouldn't they gamify more of these things? I would have worn my retainer more. Come on.
Right, exactly. There were revisions of this console, as Nintendo is wont to do. We got the Game Boy Advance SP, which was a clamshell design that I remember when Geoff got me one a few years back. He found one for a good price. I held it in my hands and went, wow, it's really tiny. But I was just smaller back then when I first had it. It didn't get smaller. I got bigger. And then, of course, even at the time as a child, I looked at it and went, who is this for? Tiny Mice was the Game Boy Micro, which was mostly a novelty, but a cool idea that it was this tiny rectangular device that was not much bigger than the cartridge that would play pristine quality display, by the way, tiny versions of these games.
Yeah.
It's wild to me that that existed. Like, it was probably always considered to be a novelty. I know a lot of the specialty designs were limited quantity anyway, but like, even as a young person with healthy-ish eyes, looking at that, I went, I don't understand how anybody plays this. But I know friends who had it and loved it. It's wild to me that we got so many iterations of the console, because I think with the DS and the 3DS, when we get to those, we'll also have a lot of that iteration. But the design didn't, well, actually, I can't say that. The 3DS design changed a lot.
Yes.
Like, this has kind of always been Nintendo's MO since even the Game Boy. I mean, we talked about the Pocket and the Color. They like to iterate and they like to refresh. And like, we like to scoff. As of the day we're recording, Sony announced the PS5 Pro, which I think is still probably completely useless. But not the time for that discussion. I feel like these Nintendo redesigns served purposes. I mean, for sure the Advance did, because it added a backlight, a thing that, a front light and then a backlight. But light for this, so you didn't have to play under the light of the passing street lights in your car at night when you were traveling playing a Game Boy.
Yeah, that to me was its only real weakness, was the backlight. I do think of the Game Boy SP as the definitive version of the console overall. I just think that adding that backlight fixes its one real weakness, and then the ability to like close it shut and the rechargeable battery, definitely a game changer in an era where batteries were a big deal. You were going through double A's, or we know like the Game Gear, you got to put the 4 chunky batteries in it and it just drains your battery in like an hour. So rechargeable battery, especially for me as a kid, where my parents would just be like, I'm not buying any more batteries for it this month. You got to just wait. Having the rechargeable battery was a complete game changer. And I find it interesting that, just doing a little bit of research for this episode, the Game Boy Advance sold 81 million units. Over half of those were the SP variant. So the Game Boy SP sold just a little bit more than half of the total lifetime sales of the Game Boy Advance. It was surprising to me because, again, in my research too, Satoru Okada was the guy who had been experimenting with color on the Game Boy ever since like the mid 90s, when Nintendo decided to not go color right away. He brought the idea to Nintendo pretty early on. He's like, hey, like we need to do something with color and it needs to be lit and all this kind of stuff. And he brought the idea of the SP to them, and they were really, really against it. They basically shut him down right away. I mean, I think history proves him right that putting out that console with the backlight was the best thing that ever happened to that console, for sure.
Oh, yeah. And I would imagine some of that has to do with timeline. It's why the Virtual Boy was only one color. It's not that they were afraid of having 3-color diodes. They went, we are having 32-bit processors send out 2 separate images, and if we want to save any money,
Right.
we can pick one color. And so, yeah, no, of course, this is what they were always working towards. And it's great that it happened when it did. Having that light there, I'm sure a lot of those sales were the fact that there were people who had Game Boys, Game Boy Colors, and were perfectly happy with them. And, I mean, actually very germane to the PS5 Pro. Anyone sitting here who owns a PS5 going, why do I need the Pro? Do I really? People with the Game Boy Color going, do I need the Advance? Yeah, there's some nice games, but I like what I'm playing. There's a light on it. I'm getting this now kind of feeling. But I will argue, the original, the Game Boy Advance form factor, better form factor.
I agree.
Correct.
Yes.
I agree. I think it was better for playing games. I think that it's too crunched, especially with my giant person hands now. It doesn't work for large hands. And there are folks in the modding scene who are modding the backlit screens to those original form factors, which one of these days I will spend a lot of money on that, even though I have an analog pocket, just to have it, like rewiring it, adding rechargeable batteries, adding a backlit screen.
We can bribe Alex Lavelle.
Yeah, pretty much. I'm just going to throw a ton of money at Alex Lavelle and say, make this for me, please.
Help a friend. Help a friend, help a friend.
Exactly. Man, I think we should talk about some games and then get out of here, because otherwise we're going to be here for 2 hours. We shouted out some games earlier, but like I really do have to point out that so many of my favorite games, I could make a top 10 games list of all time just from Game Boy Advance games with ease and not be able to fit everything that I want. And I could probably say that for a lot of consoles, but I don't think it'd be as difficult as it would be for this console. It's for several reasons. It's not just the quality of the games. It's not just the quality of the console, but I think it's my point in my gaming journey when this console came out. Like, I was a little young for the Game Boy, was starting to get into games, but by the time the Game Boy Advance came through, it was like I was established playing video games, owned multiple consoles, was ready for this next thing, and it just had so many definitive games in a series on this. I mean, we mentioned Zero Mission before, which alone is a great remake of the original Metroid, which I still to say this day is basically unplayable on the NES, unless you have a lot of time, which I do not. But Metroid Fusion remains one of my favorite Metroid games of all time. And I know I've talked about this in other places, but not only is it one of the best looking Metroid games ever, but it is the point where Metroid really felt like a horror game. You felt it in 1 and 2 a little, but Metroid Fusion is when it really was a survival horror game as well. The survival horror in the sense that you were trying to survive and it was horror. Because there's some creepy shit going on. The first time the SAX looks at the camera and it zooms in on those lifeless eyes,
scared
to this day,
shitless.
It still spooks
I was
me.
terrified.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those chase sequences are nuts. I replayed Metroid Fusion earlier this year for the first time in a long time. And yeah, it still gets your pulse going. It's great.
I tell people all the time that Metroid Fusion is my favorite horror game because it really is.
Yeah. That thing you fight that's made of melting TVs, I don't even remember what it was called.
I don't know any boss name besides Kraid, Ridley, or Mother Brain.
Right.
Everything else is just horrifying.
That scary thing.
That scary
Basically.
thing. My nightmares.
Yeah. But like even talking to the sound design, we jumped over Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga a little bit, but like the Italian gibberish that like Mario and Luigi are basically known for now, that Charles Martinet
Iconic.
perfected.
Yeah.
It has voice acting in a Mario game. They aren't saying anything.
No, they are.
But it's voice acting.
Jump!
Yeah, that's true.
Yes, it's true. It's true.
No, they say their abilities and everything else is gibberish.
Geoff, holy shit, that's really good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've heard them a lot recently. I also replayed Superstar Saga this year.
But like, the reason I keep coming back to this console and I was so excited to talk about it is I just have so many favorites on here. I mean, there's so many definitive versions. To some people, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance is the way to play a Final Fantasy Tactics game. I know it's not the same as Final Fantasy Tactics. I know it does differently, even though I've not played either version to this day, to my great shame. But like, I know people who swear by that game, saying the PlayStation game's fine, but I love Advanced. I love this version of the game.
Well, those are two different games. The PSP is the
Yeah.
remake of the PS1 one. But yeah, what they do with Tactics Advance, where they have it be an alternate world where you have the different races, sort of this is the Ivalice that Final Fantasy 12 pulls from, where you've got the
Right.
Numu, the Mughals, the Banga, and all of the other races and everything else. It is a hell of a game. The mission-based structure is a lot. That's another one that I think I'm due for another go. I played it a bit when I was a kid, but I wasn't ready for that level of complication, so I guess the old Japanese markets were a little bit right about Americans and RPGs, but I will prove them wrong, if only out of spite, which is my greatest motivating factor.
It's true.
But no, they're incredible games.
We could laundry list every game that's incredible, but I think, one, we'd be here all day. But like, I mean, I know for you, Geoff, some of your favorite Castlevania games are on here. I know that the DS are like your pinnacle for a lot of the Castlevania stuff, but like, I know you love these games. I feel like your love started with Symphony of the Night, but was solidified by these games, right? By the advanced games?
It's very funny. Because of the timing of when I got the Game Boy Advance, I got all the Game Boy Advance titles. It was sort of a backwards thing. I went from Symphony of the Night to Dawn of Sorrow, the first Metroidvania on the DS, which was a direct
interesting.
sequel to the last GBA game, Aria of Sorrow. So there's that sort of duology there. I fell in love with it in the DS titles. And then I went back and played the GBA titles. And yeah, no, to completely blow up the spot here, if I have to pick a single favorite for the Game Boy Advance, I'll give honorable mentions. Let's do our hit parades, but Aria of Sorrow is my number one.
Yeah.
And is it your number one Game Boy Advance game and Castlevania game, or just Game Boy Advance?
I'll give it Game Boy Advance.
Okay. I know you picking your favorite Castlevania game of all time is a little harder.
That's depends on the day and where the moon is in the sky kind of thing. But Aria of Sorrow is aces as far as design, as far as mood and atmosphere. The soul system is fucking spectacular. The soul system is great. All three of the Game Boy Advance games were really playing with different ways of having character advancement. The card system from Circle the Moon was cool. The souls, the power of dominion in Aria of Sorrow was perfect. It was so goddamn good that that's what Bloodstained is basing all of its shard stuff off of. Like, yeah, it's borrowing from a lot of other things and getting a lot of Koji Igarashi kind of design stuff. But it's like, I can't believe I'm not Soma Cruz is basically the story of Bloodstained. And I'm not mad about it.
Yeah, it's funny. I'll get to my favorite in a minute, but like, I do have to shout out the Legacy of Goku series on the Game Boy Advance because like, they weren't great games, but it was the first time for America that we got a narrative-based Dragon Ball Z game where you played through the sagas, Legacy of Goku 2, and then Boost Fury, and got to play through all of these famous arcs. We would get Kakarot later, we'd get some of the other games, but it was always fighting games. And like, I like fighting games, but they weren't what I wanted to play for the Dragon Ball Z story.
Well, the tournament arcs are cool in Dragon Ball, but it's an adventure. You're exploring.
Right.
And I love those games. They are not perfect, but like, I thought they was great. And like on the opposite side, again, the Sonic Advance games are some of the best 2D Sonic games. They gave Sonic tricks in them where you could do these flourishes as you ran. You got to play as Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and Amy. And Amy is a character who is often mistreated in that franchise. And I have a lot more to say about that in maybe an upcoming episode of another podcast. But the fact that you could play as her, she had her hammer, as I recall, and like also the design style, like the anime kind of design style of the drawings of those characters that had existed for years were brought to life in the sprite work of these games in a way that like the 3D models just couldn't quite capture. The 3D models had their own charm, especially in the Dreamcast era. But like the thing about Sonic games is people like to say, oh, they're games about speed. They're not about platforming. That's incorrect. They are about platforming at speed. The best Sonic games allow you to make precision platforming while moving at max speed and doing cool tricks in the process and feeling cool while you do it. They are about speed, and I like when you get to go fast, but The best Sonic games allow you to go fast and still do precision platforming, which is not impossible. Tons of games in the massive core platforming genre have made money on that. And so I think that's why I also like these Sonic games so well, because they were designed to do that. There were less bottomless pits, there were more multi-level stages, and just tons of platforming at speed, which is what Sonic should be about. I do have to say, my favorite Game Boy Advance game is the best full stop 2D platformer ever made, and it's Wario Land 4. Wario Land 4, aesthetically, musically, and narratively, design-wise, is just one of the coolest frickin' games ever. It's oozing style. It's so much fun to play. The boss fights are so frickin' weird. Talk about horrifying boss designs. They are some of the weirdest. It's a treasure hunting game, and again, spawned a whole genre of other games, not Mario games, but Wario games and Wario likes. Pizza Tower and the forthcoming Anton Blast took two different aspects from this one game and made them the focal. You know, one more on speed, one more on precision and treasure hunting, but both fantastic games, the bits of both that I've played. But it started for me with Wario Land 4. I've always liked the Wario Land games. I like Wario Land 1, but there's something really special about 4 because they finally didn't just give Wario different power-ups, but they went, well, if we were making a game about Wario, how would it be different? Well, he'd be in a hurry, he'd be cranky, he'd want treasure, he'd want to explore, it'd be less about speed precision platforming, except in certain levels where you are doing speed precision platforming. Also, Wario's weird, so let's make it weird as heck. The cocktail for what I love about video games and why I'm so excited about Anton Blast. The story of Anton Blast is you are Anton, the biggest lush in the world, and the devil's coming from hell to steal all your booze, and you have to get it back. Because you're so drunk, you're redder than the devil, and he doesn't like it.
This is why I love video games, because that is a perfectly cromulent plot, and I'm excited to play it.
Yeah, and so the last thing I'll say on Wario Land 4 is that I replayed it earlier this year on my Analog Pocket, and it still holds up. Like, there were moments where I got frustrated, but all in all, it is a well-designed, tight, great, fun game. And honestly, if to this day you have not played it, and you've not played any of the Wario Land games, I absolutely recommend that you can start with 4 easily and have a great time.
And all this being said, there are still some incredible platformers on the Game Boy Advance. There's stuff like there's Klonoa, Empire of Dreams, which I feel often gets forgotten that I love playing. There is Ninja 5.0, which recently got a modern updated re-release. I mean, they didn't update the graphics or anything, but a really cool ninja game with bionic commando-like grappling hook physics that more people should play. Super a lot of fun. There are fantastic pinball games that have come out for it. There is Pokemon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire, Pinball of the Dead, Mario Pinball Land, which doesn't have a great score, but I have it on good authority from the other half of my household that it's a great pinball game. Those people just suck at pinball. Her words, not mine. But it's also worth pointing out this was where a little bit of the WarioWare and the Rhythm Heaven series got it started. Rhythm Tengoku. I remember watching the videos of this before there was any other Rhythm Heaven games and going, I need this. And got it in the last year, and I am not disappointed in it at all. I think the one other little piece, speaking of Sarah, that I need to shout out on her behalf as far as Game Boy Advance is there is a Namco collection on here called Namco Museum. Sarah, infamously, is very good at Galaga.
Yes.
Namco Museum on the GBA on long car rides is where Sarah honed her skills. And so
Amazing.
I think that deserves, for our associate producer, I believe that deserves just a little bit of a shout out.
Amazing.
This is definitely a handheld where so many people will have very justified favorites that I will never have heard of until that moment, and I love that.
And before I forget, not just one, but 2 Mario series got launched on this console because it wasn't just Mario and Luigi which launched on this console, but also Mario vs. Donkey Kong.
Yes.
That whole puzzle spinoff, which has been prolific and got remade recently, that also debuted on this console. And like, it's so funny to me that like no straightforward Mario game, but 2 brand new Mario franchises, which I guess still makes it, as far as Mario goes, unique. And also some of the biggest spin-offs like Mario Tennis was here, Mario Golf, Mario Kart, Mario Party Advance, and then Pinball Land you mentioned. There was still so much Mario on this console without a brand new 2D platformer, which is actually kind of wild.
I will join Cam Hawkins in saying that every time a Pokemon Direct happens and they do not announce more Pokemon Pinball, the world grows a little darker.
I would absolutely agree.
But Eric, you've been extremely patient with us ranting about our
Yes,
favorite
listen,
games. Please,
it's
the floor is yours.
It's like I'm just listening to the podcast, like in the room with both of you. I mean, that's my favorite genre of podcast is friends talking, and you get the passion is very, very evident. First of all, I'd like to Nintendo. If anyone at Nintendo is listening, I'm talking to anyone. It sounds like we're due for another Wario Land game. Like, why hasn't this happened yet? Look at the creativity they've done with Mario Odyssey, Mario Wonders. 2 really creative games with their main mascot. Look how creative they've been with Zelda. Like, why can't we have just a crazy, freaking weird Wario Land game come out on the Switch? I think it's time. Stop relegating him. Even though the WarioWare games are very good, stop relegating him to WarioWare. Like, let's have a traditional Wario Land game. I think it's time. That being said, I'll keep mine brief. We've already mentioned a lot of them. We don't need to talk about Metroid anymore. I will briefly once again touch on Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. I love Paper Mario. It's good. I believe that Superstar Saga is the true spiritual successor to Mario RPG, one of my personal favorite games of all time. And it boasts my favorite video game composer of all time, Yoko Shimomura, who just absolutely killed it on the sound design for that game. It's so good. I recently replayed Superstar Saga. It's got so much charm to it. Hands down, far and away, I said this in the group chat when we first came together, I am the ambassador for Advance Wars on the Game Boy Advance. Advance Wars is by and far 1 and 2 because they're kind of the same game. 2 is just kind of almost like an expansion pack for 1. It just changes some stuff, adds a couple little tweaks and more maps in another campaign. But the Advance Wars series on Game Boy Advance is addicting. It's colorful. The music will stick in your ear. And it's sneakily a very, very important title for Nintendo's history. I did a whole episode about how Advance Wars changed Nintendo because they weren't originally going to send Advance Wars overseas to the West. They were just going to keep it as a Japan exclusive. The Wars series had been Japan exclusive since it was Famicom Wars back in the 80s. Somebody at Nintendo of America got their hands on Advance Wars and was like, you have to send this over here. It's too good for you not to. And Nintendo was really, still at that time, they were more open to sending more things over, but they were still really picky about what they did. And they were worried that a Western audience wouldn't be receptive to Advance Wars. But they sent it over and it did great. And it really is responsible for us getting Fire Emblem in the States as well. Probably my second favorite game. The Intelligent Systems games rank 1-2 on the Game Boy for me. But Advance Wars on GBA is an important title in Nintendo's history. And softening them up and getting them used to the idea that, hey, they can send different types of things over here and they will be successful. And my headcanon is that probably led to them, again, putting a lot of these RPGs and a lot of these games that we didn't get on the Game Boy Advance to send over here. They felt more comfortable with it. So God bless the people at Nintendo of America who fought for us to get Advance Wars over here. I love it. It still has a really, really robust community around the Game Boy Advance game specifically. We just got the remake by wavered, which I wasn't critically received well. I thought it was fantastic, but this is my pitch for Advance Wars. If you're interested in Fire Emblem, but you're intimidated by some more of the hardcore mechanics like the permadeath and stuff like that, Advance Wars is a really great entry game because it's basically Fire Emblem, but you can lose your units and there's no penalty for it because you can just build new units and it's more modern military spin on it. So go and play Advance Wars. There's a really, really healthy, robust community. There's a competitive community. People in the community took the source code from the game. They put it on a web browser site called Advance Wars by Web, and you can play it turn-based against people from across the entire world. And I just think it's so cool that game is being kept alive in that format. And they have it's like chess. They have grandmaster rankings and tournaments and all this stuff. It's such an unbelievably fun and lovely community. And people are willing to help you learn the basics of competitive Advance Wars because competitive Advance Wars is fucking bananas. It's insane.
That is wild.
Yeah, it's so cool. There's so much fan and love and community love around those games. I already mentioned Fire Emblem 7 and Fire Emblem the Sacred Stones. To this day, Fire Emblem is still one of my favorite franchises. It's thriving here after Three Houses. Engage wasn't received as well, but people love Three Houses. I would argue it's probably one of Nintendo's main franchises to sell here. And then the last one, I got to give a shout out to my boy Nomura, Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories. One of the more divisive titles in the series, but I think it's really unique because it's the only Kingdom Hearts game you don't get in this 3D style. The pixel artwork, the sprite work for Chain of Memories is unbelievable. It's so unique for the Kingdom Hearts series. People have a problem with the card-based system and the way that kind of built. They tried to shoehorn the card system into it.
It was a big time for cards in the early aughts.
But once you get the hang of it, once you know how to exploit it and break it, it's not that big of a deal. And fun fact about this one, Nomura wasn't even going to make Kingdom Hearts games for Game Boy Advance. He just wanted to work on Kingdom Hearts 2. But a lot of the devs on his team came up to him and said, oh, our kids would love to play a Game Boy Advance version of a Kingdom Hearts game. And so he basically did it for his team because like he had kids that wanted to play it. And he was kind of moved by that, which, again, super rare thing that would never happen anymore in this day and age. But good guy Nomura doing it for the kids. Those are some of my favorites. Matt mentioned Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland, like one of the best Kirby experiences, in my opinion, right up there with Superstar. Minish Cap you got, Mario Kart Super Circuit, and then Breath of Fire 2 was probably my first experience with a JRPG that wasn't Final Fantasy back when I was 10 years old. So it was probably my first non-Final Fantasy RPG experience, I guess, besides Pokemon and Super Mario RPG. Really like a JRPG outside of what would be considered mainstream. Oh, yeah, I love those games so much. I play Advance Wars at least like a couple times a month still to this day.
It's so funny. I have never played Advance Wars. I've never played any of the Wars titles.
Oh,
Me neither.
It's really good.
I remember them being a very, if not a launch title, a very early GBA title, and how big of a response it got. Honestly, your sales pitch has gotten me intrigued.
Yes.
I don't know how deep down the well I can afford to go as far as time goes, but I think I could pay a visit.
It's very conducive to picking up and putting down because Fire Emblem
like
kind
that.
of is more story driven, but
Mhm.
Advance Wars, there is a plot there, but you can jump into a map, play a few turns, and then jump out. It's not a time commitment, which is, I think, is his biggest strength.
That's fair. It sounds skirmish happy. That's
Yes.
nice. One other game that I do want to shout out real quick, because I'm in the middle of playing it, and you mentioned Way Forward. We need more games like Sigma Star Saga, which is an absolutely bananas RPG where the random battle system is a side-scrolling shoot 'em up.
That's insane.
It is absolutely bonkers, and the plot is bonkers to match. I'm only partway through it, but it's weird, it's wild. They were clearly trying out a bunch of ideas, and so it's got that wonderful mix of this is amazing, this is terrible, this is like, and back and forth, rapid succession. Sometimes the same thing is both. These guys did a great job. More companies should take a stab at this, and we're going to find more favorites. The GBA has something for everybody, and more than you realize.
Mhm.
I do have to ask, if someone wanted to play Advance Wars for the first time, could you start with the remake, or would you recommend through totally legal means playing the original Game Boy Advance
I
version
think you
instead?
could start with the remake. The strength of the GBA games is that Advance Wars 1 has what many people have called one of the best tutorials in a video game ever. It does a very, very good job of teaching you how to play the game ins and outs. The remake does too. It's a little bit more streamlined. So yeah, if you wanted to pick up the remake, I think that's a perfectly acceptable way to play it because it's got both games in one package, and there's a lot of quality of life improvements to that game that are more conducive to new players. Like you can rewind your last turn if you feel like you made like a devastating mistake, so you don't have to like start all over. Very time-friendly improvements to people that don't have as much time to play games, but I think there's just something so specific about the GBA experience for 1 and 2. Even though I love the remake, it still has me going back to the GBA games just because of like the sprite work, the presentation, the music. It's just such a great package.
I love that.
And I will say that I agree with you on how gorgeous Chain of Memories looks. How it plays is another story. I won't get into it, but it definitely looks great. It
Yeah,
definitely
props
looks
with gameplay, call me. I'll teach you how to break it. It'd be super easy.
Oh, good. There we go. Maybe I'll finally play it then, because for sure I couldn't get through that game. And like Cam Hawkins, his spirit is lurking somewhere, just yelling that it's still one of the best Kingdom Hearts games. I believe you, but I couldn't do it.
I just listened to their Kingdom Hearts series that they're doing like last week or something.
Yeah.
Been a big
Yeah.
inspiration for my
It's good,
series.
good
for
stuff.
Sure.
Nice. Well, Eric, thank you for joining us on
Thank you
this
so much.
episode. I feel like this is one of those consoles that if I don't kind of curtail the conversation, we will just gush endlessly about all the great games forever, which would be to our benefit, but to the detriment of everyone listening, because nobody wants a 4-hour podcast about the GBA, or maybe they do.
It's a little out of the ordinary for us. I think if that was more our style, I think people would appreciate it. But I think also people appreciate our sense of brevity.
For sure.
You know.
For sure.
Yes,
After we've been recording for 90 minutes, I don't know how long this episode's going to be.
correct.
I just want to say thanks to both of you for having me on. I've been a longtime listener of Fun and Games. You let me come on and do a side quest episode, inspired by what you guys do, and I try to bring as much of that positive energy that you've shown here into my show. And you've just been both. This has exceeded like all my expectations. Like I'm gonna leave this grinning from ear to ear. My wife's gonna be like, "What were you doing down there?" Like,
It made me cry.
Aw.
Thank
Well,
you
thank
so
you,
much,
Eric.
Eric.
I appreciate it. I mean, I've loved the Unlockables. Your Super Mario RPG episode is one of my favorite versions of coverage of that. And I've been on other podcasts talking about that games. Also, the series on Final Fantasy IX that you did with Rick is probably some of the best gaming podcasting ever. And I've always wanted to collaborate on this level. I'm excited to collaborate in the future.
Hell yeah.
And I'm grateful that you jumped in on this. Please, before we wrap up, I would love for you to give a full pitch for the Unlockables and all the other stuff that you're working on. Please tell folks where they can find you online and, of course, check out the podcast.
Yes, so like at the top I said, it's the Unlockables, the story of video games, people who play them, and the memories made along the way. You can find it on pretty much any podcatcher. And if you have one of your choice that it doesn't automatically go there, just let me know and I'll put it there for your listening convenience. If you want to find me on all the socials and all that fun stuff, you can go to linktr.ee/Unlockables Podcast. You can find the Instagram there, Twitter, and the link to the Discord, although my Discord's not as robust as a lot of other people's are, but we do have a little bit of fun there. And mostly it's just a way for people to keep up on what I'm doing and what I'm putting out. If you do like ridiculously long episodes, you can check out my Guide and Key series, which has, at the time of this recording, I think like 20 or 21 episodes with like 34 hours of Kingdom Hearts analysis, if that's your cup of tea.
Amazing.
So you're about 5% through it.
Yeah, it's about 5%. Yeah.
Yep, about that.
No, probably by the time this records, we'll be through Kingdom Hearts 3, and then we have 2 games left after that, and then we'll be done until 4 comes out, and then I'll be dragged back in. But that's been like a 2-year journey that I've been on to try and put that out. In between that, I've gotten married and had a kid, and it's just been it's been crazy. So if you want to check out the show, send me a message. I'm super receptive. Once again, thank you guys so much for letting me come on here and just gush for like an hour and a half about something I love so much.
That's why we're here. We like talking about the things that we love,
Yep.
and the GBA is easy to love.
Yes, absolutely. And, of course, listeners, we turn to you. What's your favorite Game Boy Advance game? Did you own a Game Boy Advance? If you didn't, when it came out and got it later, when did you get it? Are you a late bloomer like Geoff often is? Or did you have it when it first dropped? I don't know. I don't know why I'm picking on Geoff in this moment, but it's
No,
just...
please do. This is fine. I just like making faces. That's for us.
Please tell us your experience with the Game Boy Advance. We would love to hear it. I always love hearing folks' favorite games about consoles. I mean, and it plays into the ethos of this show. Every game is somebody's favorite, and often we don't even think of some of the favorites that others might have. So please chime in. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah, we've definitely forgotten some of our own favorites, so please remind us, let us know. Let us know those games that made your childhood so good, even if you would never go back to them now willingly, but they saw you through long car rides, bus rides, long waits anywhere, or just was a fun place to go. How much did it blow your mind when you realized some games you could close the GBA SP and it would go to sleep?
Mind blowing.
Mind blowing. Like RPGs, long form games, this was a game changer completely and utterly. Pun, whatever. I don't care. It was amazing. Did it blow your mind too? Let us know. Let us know your Game Boy Advance link cable stories. Let us know about how much both Eric and I screwed up for skipping Gen 3 Pokemon.
Yep.
I also got into it in college, but it was Gen 4 because I'm just, that whatever grouping of years older. But let us know. Reach out to us. There's so many great ways to get in contact. We are Fun and Games Pod across all social media that we are currently active on, which as of this episode is Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Tumblr. We are funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, what you thought of previous episodes, what you'd like us to talk about, who you'd like us to talk with in future episodes. Show us your Game Boy Advance collection. Show us your favorite Game Boy Advance colors. Was there a Game Boy Advance color that you wished you could get? Let us know about that one too. Or if you've got one that you want to make us jealous, send it to us. Show us your collection. Or whatever other questions you may have. If you want a one-stop spot for all the things we're working on or want to support us in ways other than just listening to the show, you can visit our Patreon, patreon.com/funandgamespod. All of our episodes are up there. Any articles written by myself or Matt are up there. And we appreciate everybody who is a patron. There is a free tier, so you do not have to donate any money to be a part of the Patreon, but we appreciate everyone's support and everyone who has donated money to keep us going and let us do all kinds of crazy things. And we'd like to shout out the people on the high scoreboard. Today, the high scoreboard is Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Roger Reichart, Alejandro Alves, Curly Bright, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Robert Prine, Sean Bowen, and Wes Bates. Thank you so much for your support. please enter your initials. We are running it on a Game Boy Color cartridge, so don't accidentally touch the shoulder buttons because it will stretch it out in a way that I don't know why anybody wants it. And be sure to leave your system out of the sun because it'll be a really weird... Did you know, like with sun damage, you could kind of get a little bit of a tan line? My copy of Link's Awakening is like that. We don't want that. We don't want that. We want these initials to look good. That's all. I'm just looking out for you, okay? Thank you.
I can't believe that we talked for an hour and a half about this console and didn't talk about the shoulder button death. The shoulder button death that killed multiple consoles for me, and I had to rebuy this stupid
Tell
system.
us about your shoulder button death.
Yes.
It made playing Circle of the Moon such a pain in the butt. If you want to continue those sort of conversations, you can also go to our Discord. You can visit certainpov.com and find not only other fantastic Certain POV podcasts, but a permanent invite link to our Discord server where a lot of these conversations continue. People post about the games that they've beaten, the game recommendations that they have, and we'd love to see you there.
Also, the best free way to support us and any other podcast is to go to your podcast platform of choice and rate and review the show. I know tons of you folks who listen who have yet to do that because I know you by name. And I'm looking for those reviews. Not all of you have Apple, and that's fine. But seriously, go to Spotify, go to Apple, go to Good Pods, rate and review. It really helps push us to the top of the algorithm. So when folks search for the Game Boy Advance and want to find podcasts about the Game Boy Advance, we jump to the top of the list. So please take 5 minutes and do that right now, or I'll find you.
I didn't know Matt had a hit list, but if I had to define one, I guess that's the one that makes the most sense.
I'm going to go make sure that I review real quick.
Whether you've gotten yourself off of Matt's pod review hit list, whether you are on the Discord, whether you are chatting with us across social media, or whether this is your first episode that you're listening to, all of that is helpful. All of that is wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. We couldn't do this without you. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm at AK Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hey, Nerf herders.
You sure you want to go with that?
Hey, everyone.
There we go. More inviting.
Have you ever had a movie that you really wanted to love, but something holds you back?
Or one that you did love in spite of a flaw?
Well, I'm Case Aiken.
And I'm Sam Alisea.
And on Another Pass, we sit down with cool guests to look at movies that we find fascinating.
But flawed.
And we try to imagine what could have been done when they were made to give them that little push.
We're not experts. We just believe in criticism.
Constructive criticism.
Sure.
So come take another pass at some movies with us.
And every now and then, we can celebrate movies that did it on their own, too.
You can find us at certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Pass it on.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.